The story that I want to share today is out of Mark chapter 9, and it's really a story of disappointment. Now you're going to look at this story and say, well, I've heard this story many, many times. What's the disappointment? But I want to look at it this morning and see what you say. Chapter 9, we're going to really look at verse 14 through verse 29. But that's not where 9 starts. 9 starts with the transfiguration. And so here we have Jesus and Peter and James and John, the three in the inner group, up in the mountainside. The transfiguration occurs. Peter is just blown away. They all are enveloped by a cloud and God's Spirit and seeing Moses and seeing Elijah. And Peter says, it would be good if we could just stay here forever. And this is recorded in 3 different places, but I'm in Mark. But this would be good. Let's just stay here indefinitely. And of course, that was impossible. They had to come back down the mountain, just like we come back from the northern Sierra. We've got to come back over the grapevine. They had to come back to reality. And in verse 14 it says, as they came down, it says, when they came to the other disciples, so there was 9 other disciples, right? At this point there's 12 disciples. 3 were with Christ, saw unbelievable things, and the other 9 were back down and had drawn a crowd, evidently. It said, when they came to the other disciples, they saw a large crowd around them, and the teachers of the law arguing with them. So here we see the 9 engaged in debate with the professors from their seminaries, and with the religious leaders and the Pharisees, and the theologians. And they're arguing about something. And as soon, verse 15, as soon as all the people saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with wonder and ran to greet them. So here we see this crowd, they come down. Jesus has his eye on the 9 disciples. And there's this big crowd standing all around the 9, arguing with them, probably in legal terms. And when we say arguing, what we really mean is debate. When I was, in my doctoral studies, we would be taught how to argue. Well, we weren't really arguing like you would with your spouse, where you've got to win. You're just, in a sense, you're debating, how can I write in an argumentative style? And that's kind of what they're saying here. They're not arguing, there's not a heated discussion. They're just debating the issues like we would argue in school. And many of you are still in school, and you've got to learn how to write, in a certain way. And that's what I think our studies are all about. That's what's going on here. Verse 16. Jesus says, what are you arguing with them about? Now, who's he addressing? Is he addressing the 9, or is he addressing the theologians? See, until they come down from the mountain, it's just Jesus and the inner circle, the 3. They're having this great time. And there's a time of fellowship, and there's a worshipful time, and they experience the presence of God. And I don't mean the presence of Jesus, but the presence of the Father. And they see it, they hear the voice, and it's one of those once-in-a-lifetime experiences. They really don't want it to end. And yet they come down and they see these people engaged in debate. So he asks the crowd, what are you arguing about? What are you debating? The room goes silent. And no one answered. And then we see a man come forward. He's a little worn. He's very tired. He's middle-aged. He's got some hair, but he's beginning to bald. And he makes his way through the crowd to where Jesus was. And here's what he says. In verse 17. He says, Teacher, I brought you, my son, who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. In other words, stiff like a board. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not. So you picture this man leaving the crowd, no one answering. What are you debating? What are you arguing about? There's no record that there was any answer to it. But out of that crowd comes one man who's got a concern. And this voice of this man, we want to understand, is a little like the voice in tone, like a store clerk. We would direct our words toward a store clerk who we think might have cheated us out of a little bit of money. It's not just loving words. It's not a gracious tone. It's more of an accusing tone. And he comes to Jesus and talks about this boy of his. And he says, I brought him to you. And he says, I asked your disciples. And in the Greek, that word asked can actually be translated told. So if you understand the tone correctly, I think you might read it like this. I told your disciples to drive out that demon. Is that possible? Do we talk to strangers like that? Well, see, if we've had a bad experience, if our expectations have not been met, then we get a little bit irritated to where we're at some point, we're willing to leave the crowd and take a stand. And when no one else moves, we might be willing to move because we've got to set the record straight. And the record here is that I asked your disciples, I told your disciples to cast a demon out of my boy, and they couldn't do it. I see the theologians doing this, crossing their arms smugly. They just won the debate. Yeah, we've been having a debate, and I see your boys, Jesus, can't do what we asked him to do. We win. Can you picture it? Can you picture the crowd? Do you see the crowd in your mind? Do you see the man? Now, the man and Jesus are not part of the crowd. They're off by themselves. And it's only the two that are hearing this conversation going on. It's just the conversation between the two of them. But it's the Pharisees, it's that attitude, it's the theologians, it's those people that are teaching in the seminaries. We got him. We got him. They were always waiting to catch him. And Jesus says this after this dead silence occurred again. Because there was really no answer. I told your disciples to do it. They didn't do it. Dead silence. And then Jesus replies, he says, O unbelieving generation, how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me. Now, the boy's not a boy. The boy's not a child. So he's somewhere between being a child and being a grown man. He's young enough that we would still say he was not a man, but he's old enough that this has been, that this circumstance that's occurred to him has been going on a very, very long time. I would picture this boy being maybe 15, 16, 17. Can you kind of get that in your mind? Not exactly a boy, but certainly not yet a man. Verse 20, it says, so they brought him. I want to say this. Once Jesus said, bring him